It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, Labour peer Shami Chakrabarti, and a brace of comedians, Conservative supporter Jeff Norcott and former Labour speechwriter Matt Ford. Today, concern about the so-called Indian variant of coronavirus. Could we see a return to local lockdowns?
We rule nothing out. We're watching it very, very carefully.
Also today, the government wants to introduce ID for voting, but not everyone's on board.
I think it's total and I think it's trying to give a solution to a problem that doesn't exist.
And here's a question.
In terms of a smaller state and deregulation and lower taxes, are there any Thatcherites left in the government?
We'll come to that later on. But let's start with the appearance of the former Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, who is going to be questioned by MPs on a select committee about his lobbying activities on behalf of the collapsed financial firm Greensill Capital. Now, it's the first time we'll hear from him publicly since this all came to light. So my opening question, briefly, to all of you is, how big a moment is it, Miriam?
Well, let's see what he says, and I wouldn't like to anticipate the outcome of that questioning. And obviously for me in Penistone and Stocksbridge, it is quite significant. We have the Liberty Steelworks here where jobs are at risk because of what's happened with Greensill. So let's see what he says.
Well, I'm sure your constituents will be listening in. Shami, is this a big moment politically?
Well, again, I'm going to have to agree with Miriam that, I will wait to hear what he says. I don't think that politics will be determined in this country over these issues, but, matters of governance, matters of ethics are important in politics, and the behaviour of past ministers and prime ministers across the board is really important. The bigger questions are about a vision for the country going forward through and post-pandemic, but it's really bad for all of us who care about democratic politics if former prime ministers, whatever their stripe, are seen to be lobbying for their mates.
Right. Jeff, how do you see it? It is the first time, as I said, that we will actually hear and see David Cameron having to respond to all the questions around this issue. Is it a big moment?
Well, it's a big moment. I think it'll definitely be interesting. It will be intriguing. And it's one of those things that in the context of COVID, that in another political era would have had a lot more attention and scrutiny. But in fairness to the general public, while we're still coming out the other side of a pandemic, it's one of those things that is important, but might have been much more important if it had happened in a different time.
Matt?
Well, I think it's a big deal for him. This is about his legacy and how he's seen by the public. The most important person in this whole thing is David Cameron. And I think other former prime ministers will attest that life after high office can be very difficult in the way that the public view you. So for him, he certainly won't want to be seen as someone who, firstly, his record is that he delivered an outcome in a referendum that he didn't agree with, and then he's gone off and lobbied for rich people and, in a way, kind of made a bit of a fool of himself. So for him, I think this is saving a lot of personal pride and face. I also think there are political implications for the Tories here, and I agree with people who say, oh, the pandemic's the first thing on the public's mind. But that doesn't mean that all this doesn't add up somewhere. And the danger with all this is that it starts to create a smell and an impression. Now, right now, it doesn't register in the polls. But in time, come the next election, if you keep getting stories like this about the Tory party, it will absolutely start to cut through. All right, and you can watch that coverage on BBC News. I think it starts around 2:30, the appearance of David Cameron. We're going to talk about COVID. Let me show you this headline, or our viewers at least, in the Manchester Evening News. Bolton health bosses standing ready to vaccinate all over 16s if government gives green light. Now, this is in response to spikes in COVID cases in certain areas from the Indian
variant. A particularly sharp rise in cases amongst the under 25s, who in the main are unvaccinated. Let's talk to the BBC's health correspondent, Catherine Burns. And I should just say that there is a regular SAGE COVID meeting happening today, but the Indian variant is likely to be pretty high up the agenda. Catherine, how serious is this?
Well, if you look at the numbers, it sounds like it's very serious. So in Bolton, the cases are about 153 per 100,000. To give you context, that is around the level that Leicester was at last year when it got put into lockdown. And we've seen that cases have more than tripled in a few weeks, which all sounds terrible. But there is a big but. If this had happened at any other stage in the pandemic, it would be a real panic. But vaccines have happened now, and that is really changing the picture, because what it's done is to break that link between the number of cases and then the inevitable number of hospitalisations and deaths. And we're not so far seeing any kind of increase there.
Right, but how did it actually get here? Because India was put onto the red list of countries on the 23rd of April.
So public health officials in Bolton say that, you know, they did see some cases that were obviously linked to foreign travel. Now, though, that isn't the picture anymore. This is widespread in the community there and across all age groups. So when we're looking at variants, there are three questions that really you need to answer. Is it causing more severe disease is one. It doesn't seem to be doing that. Number two is, does it spread more quickly? And this is a big one right now. So it's still really early days. We're still getting data, but we think that this one is at least as transmissible, if not considerably more, than the Kent variant, which is the dominant one in the UK right now. And the third question is about vaccines. Does it affect them? Again, it's really early days, but there are some reasons to be optimistic on that.
Right. So the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Labour Mayor Andy Burnham, is calling for surge vaccination of over 16-year-olds. What else can be done? What are the options?
Yeah, because even if that happened, which is not a given by any way, because right now the vaccines are only actually allowed to be given to over 18s, and they're working down in order of age, and they're not at that age group yet. Even if that happened, it would take a few weeks for any kind of decent levels of immunity to build up. So on the ground, it's the things that we've always had to do. It's social distancing. They're doing a lot of testing in the community, both with mobile units, testing kits. They're giving people support if they need to isolate. They've got a vaccine bus going round, because in the parts of Bolton that seem to be very affected, it seems that the uptake for vaccines is about 10% less than other bits of the country. So these are the things that can be doing right now. But Matt Hancock has been asked today about this, saying, would you rule out any kind of local lockdown? And he says, we will rule nothing out.
Right. We're going to discuss all of this. But before I let you go, Catherine, can you just tell us about the data that is out today from NHS England about patients awaiting treatment and the backlog?
Yeah, this is really the legacy of COVID we're looking at. So the headline number is nearly 5 million people in England right now waiting for routine treatment. The thing that I think really interesting, though, is the number of people who've been waiting for more than a year. So before the pandemic, we were looking at about just under 2,000 people who'd been waiting for more than a year, which was a lot. You know, these are people with painful conditions often. Now that number, 436,000. That's massive. The Institute for Fiscal Studies is talking about this, saying this is going to take billions and several years to sort out. The NHS has put some money up towards this. The government is giving the NHS an extra 160 million to tackle it. They'll be doing things like extra clinics on weekends, virtual assessments. But there is a massive, massive way to go on this.
Catherine Burns, thank you very much. Shami, returning to the issue of spikes in areas like Bolton, Andy Burnham, as I said, has suggested bringing in more vaccines for those over 16, surge vaccination. Would you support that idea?
Potentially, absolutely. I mean, I think Andy Burnham has really been quite a fantastic advocate for the people he represents during this pandemic, and of course he's been rewarded, rightly rewarded, in the polls. I think the point is that we have, all of us in this country, but some people more than others, really paid a price with our liberties. And people in Greater Manchester and other parts of the north have been in local lockdowns that have meant they've been in lockdown for more weeks than some people in other parts of the country. If we're not ruling out local lockdowns or even a slower release from the national lockdown, let's also not rule out more supportive and less intrusive policies, like, for example, vaccinating younger people, giving more financial support for self-isolation and so on.
Right. Well, Miriam, on that, because there are parts of the country, as Shami says, that have been in lockdown of one form or another, more than other parts of the country. The Prime Minister has said increasing vaccines in Bolton for that younger age group is not top of the list of priorities. Should it be?
Well, first, I'd just say I agree with Shami, and the cost to people of being locked down for so long, particularly in areas of the north of England, is huge, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. And I think it's right at this stage not to rule anything out, but we should be doing everything we can to avoid local lockdown as far as possible. So I think, firstly, increasing vaccination uptake amongst the people who are already eligible, so the 38s and over, that's very, very important. Because although case rates are important, now that we have so many people vaccinated, the link between serious illness or having the disease and serious illness and death has largely been broken as long as we have good uptakes in the vulnerable groups. So increasing uptakes and seeing those vaccine buses, that's very, very important. The really important thing to establish very quickly is, is this new strain resistant to the vaccine? If it isn't, then we do have a problem on our hands. But if it is covered by the vaccine, then as long as we continue the uptake of the vaccination programme, then it should be successfully controlled. But I do think we should be very cautious before imposing any further lockdowns, particularly on areas that have been locked down for so long.
Oh, Jeff, you're nodding. In fact, we've just heard from the Prime Minister that at the moment it certainly won't derail or delay the roadmap, and we're looking at Monday the 17th of May as one stage, and then, of course, lifting all restrictions, legal restrictions on June the 21st. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do agree with him. I mean, there was a roadmap which seemed to get quite a lot of cross-party and cross-political support. We were told at the time that, we just needed a fair wind, and the government sort of expended a fair bit of wind on telling us just how good the wind has been generally. So we've been sold, an idea. There's been a lot of buy-in, a very positive response to the vaccination, massive reduction in numbers, massive reduction, thankfully, in fatalities. But I do think that, if there is a point where they do have to return to measures, I think that, it has to be a last resort rather than a first resort, because on an ongoing basis, if they do have to go back to some sort of restrictive measures, there needs to be, it needs to happen in the context of people understanding that they've had some freedom back. You can't keep people locked down forever, and there is an issue with mass non-compliance. That's something that worries me in certain places, is that we need at least the illusion that the state and the police can impose restrictions on people. If enough people become tired enough with being locked down for long enough, you might start to see mass non-compliance. And I think it's important that we give people enough liberty as we can, while we can.
Matt?
Well, I think you have to keep people safe first and foremost. There's no good saying, oh, well, the political pressure's building on us to let people out in areas if it's running hot with COVID. The primary concern is stopping people from dying. Now, I shielded during that first lockdown. These things aren't just geographic. There will be people in areas where the restrictions are lifted that are still wary, that still don't leave the house. Once you lose sight of that primary objective to protect life, to stop people getting ill, you are pandering to different priorities. And I totally understand why those priorities are important. You have to balance all those risks. But just because things get politically difficult doesn't mean you should lose sight of the primary goal, which is to stop people dying from a highly contagious and lethal virus.
It's not just about political difficulties. As we heard in the introduction, we're hearing about waiting lists and the cost of billions that could be a consequence of that. So I understand you shouldn't just do it because of a populist reaction to people being locked down again, but there's real-term consequences to this that we perhaps now, with some benefit of vaccination, we have to equivocate more keenly between.
Shami?
Jo, just one final point on all of this. So I completely agree with life before everything. And supportive measures, not just restrictive ones, getting the balance right. But crucially, when we're talking about variants, I want to remind people of the importance of vaccinating the whole planet. And we haven't done enough as an international community. And sometimes countries like the UK and even the EU have been in a roadblock to vaccinating the planet because we haven't waived the patents, And we haven't done enough to make sure that capacity is built up in places like India and Africa and elsewhere. And the development of these various mutations just demonstrates that we're not just interconnected as a country, we're interconnected as a planet. And we really need to be working better collaboratively at the international level.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because we've had this discussion about whether some of the vaccines here, the second doses, for example, should be diverted to other parts of the world, for example, like India, Shami. And certainly Labour is saying no to that, but I certainly publicly, I take your point. But Miriam, is it a salutary reminder of this phrase, you know, none of us is safe until we're all safe?
Yes, it is. And the nature of vaccines is they do mutate. And that's always going to be something we're going to have to be on the lookout for. But obviously, the greater the proportion of the rest of the world that become vaccinated, the more the virus is suppressed internationally, the safer we are. And it's, you know, I'm really proud of this government's support for vaccination around the world. That should continue. I would encourage all countries to do the same. But it is a trade-off. I mean, we do have to protect life, but there are other intrinsic values of life that are also important, like being able to see family and friends and quality of life. These things all have to be weighed up. There are no easy decisions, and ultimately these are moral and political decisions and not just health ones.
Right. Well,
so we shouldn't rule anything out, but we should keep our eyes open about the costs of both of lockdown and non-lockdown.
Share the patents and waive the patents and share the technology so that we can boost capacity to produce vaccines elsewhere in the world.
All right. Well, one of the two. Yeah, go on, Miriam.
No, I was going to say, well, one of the reasons that the government signed the deal with AstraZeneca was because they were going to produce the vaccine with no profit at cost, which obviously is going to help the rest of the world. So I think that's a very important step forward.
But can we support President Biden and the Pope now and all these Nobel laureates in saying, let's have the TRIPS waiver that was recommended by the WHO, and not just side with Big Pharma, but actually share knowledge and technology and recipes and capacity to vaccinate the world?
Matt, you're looking sceptical?
Well, I just think this Big Pharma thing is...
Big pharmaceutical companies, yeah. Not
it's
big
just kind of an immature thing to be saying. Like, without pharmaceutical companies, we wouldn't have these vaccines. And I think AstraZeneca and others deserve huge credit for putting their brightest minds at the service of the planet. And this kind of weird, hard left view that all private enterprise is negative or sinister is odd. And it certainly doesn't chime with the public, who are grateful that AstraZeneca have done. Yeah. Without AstraZeneca, I wouldn't have had 2 jabs. I wouldn't have the protection I've got. Well, thank God for pharmaceutical companies.
Well, Shami, your weird, hard left view, is it true that you wouldn't have had the development of these vaccines?
My weird, hard left view is apparently being supported by President Biden, the Pope, Gordon Brown, Mary Robinson,
Jesus, the Easter Bunny.
I'm not here to mudsling.
Hang on, Matt.
Sorry,
hang on, Matt. But Shami, there is an important, serious point about the fact that would these pharmaceutical companies have developed these vaccines if the patents were in the way that you have described, sort of open and free to everyone?
Well, I'm supporting a temporary waiver in pandemic circumstances. And I would also say that, yes, of course, science is a collaborative thing, but governments and charitable institutions have invested a huge amount in these vaccines, including the Oxford vaccine. I think it's like over 90% of the investment in the development of the Oxford vaccine came from government and charitable purposes. I'm not here to mudsling, Jo. These issues are just far too serious.
All right, well, we're going to move on because we're going to talk... Hang on, Matt. We're going to talk about one of the tools in the armoury that the government is suggesting, which is COVID status certification. Some people call it vaccine passports. Now, it's been trialled in pilots in parts of England to allow the safe return of sports matches, people going into stadiums, events and nightclubs. Now, passes would show if a person had been vaccinated or had a recent negative test or some sort of natural immunity. Shami, what's wrong with this?
Well, I mean, you know, I've been involved in debates about compulsory ID cards for many years, as you know, Jo.
But this isn't a compulsory ID card, is it? This is a certification to show whether or not, as I say, you've been vaccinated, you'd had a negative test or natural immunity. Yeah.
But actually, this would be the most, in a way, this would be the most dangerous compulsory ID of all, because it is about your intimate health data. The other problem that so it's a recipe for it would be policed in the community by bouncers and public and so on. It's a recipe for discrimination and bullying and so on. But also, I am worried in the context of potential surges and so on, that it will create a false sense of confidence. If it's not safe for us to go back into the community, we shouldn't be wooed into the community because some of us have a certificate. I'm worried that the testing that would require would not be reliable enough, and I'm worried that it would be harmful to civil liberties, but also not actually be safe.
Right, bad idea on all sorts of fronts, Miriam.
Well, I think let's be clear about what the government have said. They're investigating this, but made very clear that they're not intending to introduce vaccine passports for everyday domestic services, so going on a train, going to the shop. So let's be clear, that is not what's on the table here. And also, let's be clear, the difference between vaccine certification, which is just part of your medical notes to show when you've had the vaccine and what type, and vaccine passports, which is something entirely different.
But would you be in favour of it being rolled out? Would you be in favour of it being rolled out?
I think we're going to end up with some sort of passports for international travel. I think that's beyond our control in the UK. But I would not support any sort of vaccine passport that would restrict your access to normal everyday life. And I think in this country, our attitude to the health status of individuals is very much characterised by tolerance, by privacy, by dignity. And any change to that is very serious. And a vaccine passport where you'd have to show your vaccination status, your medical status for everyday reasons would be a departure from that tolerance. Well, it would change the relationship between citizens and the state, and I think we should be very cautious about doing anything like that.
What about if a nightclub owner or someone running a comedy gig, for example, wanted to have people safely, as they would put it, COVID secure, but they wanted to see the certification? You're saying that shouldn't happen, Miriam?
Well, firstly, I would question the scientific reason behind that. Obviously, we can't introduce anything like this until everybody's been offered a vaccine. By that point, we anticipate that levels of COVID will be so low and the link between infection and death will be broken.
Okay.
So if you are vaccinated yourself, you are safe.
Right.
You can still transmit the disease, less likely. So what would be the advantage in that circumstance of having the vaccine passport? But also, do we really want to get into the situation where pub owners, nightclub owners are responsible for enforcing some sort of health legislation? I'm not keen on that. I think it would be a big departure from, British tolerance.
OK, well, agreement's broken out there between you two. Matt, what about you? You've got a stage show coming up, I think, fairly shortly, haven't you? The Political Party with Matt Ford. Would you be in favour of vaccine passports so that more people can go to your show?
Well, thank you for the plug, Jo. It's on the 24th and 25th of May and the 2nd of June at the Garrick Theatre and at the Vaudeville with guests including the former MP for Hartlepool, Peter Mandelson, and the current leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer.
Enough of the plug, yes.
I think it's really difficult, this, because I agree that you've always got to balance these things, and you have to balance the public health risks, you have to keep people safe, but you need to let economic activity return. And what is the safest way to do that? And if you can have some sort of proof that you've got a negative test or that you've been vaccinated, that suggests, dispassionately, that there's a road in which you can allow some safe activity to return. Now, I appreciate that there are other considerations, but we are in an imperfect situation where you're trying to do the greatest good as imperfectly as you possibly can. And it's very, very difficult. But I don't think it's the huge assault on civil liberties that other people do. I don't think it's unreasonable for a period of time that isn't going to be permanent, because, to be fair to the government, the vaccine programme is being rolled out very, very quickly. And I don't think it's unreasonable for a short amount of time. I mean, you've got a situation where, as I say, for 3 months I didn't leave the house at all. There are plenty of people whose liberties are going to be continued to be restricted beyond this period, even when you're talking about having vaccine passports. So people have paid a price for this pandemic in various different ways. You have to do the safest possible thing that allows you to get some activity. And if some sort of vaccine certification is that, I'm not necessarily against it.
What about you, Jeff? You're touring as well. Some of these venues are opening next week. They can open from the 17th of May. If you could pack it out more than having some sort of social distance or half capacity, what's not to like?
Well, absolutely. You know, as many people as possible, you know, and as a Conservative, obviously I'm going to go with that. I mean, look, I don't like the idea of it at all. And I'll come back, you know, it's good to hear what Miriam's saying, but it would be better to hear that if a government hadn't kind of switched positions so many times, both during the pandemic itself. You know, the goalposts were moved on what it would take in terms of a vaccination threshold for us to get out and about. So brilliant. If that is the position, let's hope that they stick to it. But I think it's really important, like this is a threshold that you cross in terms of a power that you give the government, and unfortunately governments of both stripes don't have a fantastic record of saying, oh, this context has now changed, here's your power back. And you know, historically we will have to account for this, everything that's happening now, we will have to account for it. And if we were to allow something like this to be imposed on people at a time when numbers are as they are, I think that is a very tricky thing to account for, and I'm very much against COVID passports.
Right. Miriam, it would only be for a temporary period of time, as the other panellists have said. Would it not help drive economic activity?
Well, I think some people may feel safer if they believe they're at an event in a place where everybody there has been vaccinated. And, you know, we have to take that into consideration. But I think what we would be doing is setting a precedent and making a permanent change to our societal values, which I don't think we should do, or certainly not without extensive debate and consensus on it. And I think if the vaccination programme is as successful as it is being now, if we continue to drive down cases, if we continue to drive down serious illness and deaths, then I don't believe there will be a need for it, and I don't believe there will a call for it. I think the government is right to look at all options right now, but the government has clearly said that they're not looking at vaccine passports in the context of normal domestic services.
Right, I mean, Shami, we're talking...
So important.
Right, well, and the timescale that's being talked about, let's say we get to June the 21st and there aren't these certification passports, whatever we want to call them, for entry to pubs or nightclubs or theatres. Would you be happy then to see full capacity in those sorts of venues, Shami? Do you think it would be safe enough just to say, no, you don't need certification, we're just going to pack it to the rafters?
Well, I think it's either safe or it's not, and I don't believe that this certification is going to be a determinant of whether it's safe or not. Because to do it on the kind of scale required would create too many false positives and negatives. You'd have to do it on the scale, you'd have to have the kind of home testing that isn't reliable enough. It's reliable enough for surge testing and you know, for testing the spread of the pandemic, but not for determining people's liberties or the safety to unlock the lockdown. So I don't think it would be a reliable public health measure. I also agree so much with Miriam and Jeff as to the dangers, not just for liberty, but also for discrimination.
Just final...
and that is the problem with this kind of policing in the community, passports in the community, passports at borders, we understand.
Yeah.
That's a fact of life in the world. But internal passports on our streets, in our communities, it's a recipe for race discrimination, other forms of discrimination and bullying. And it also changes the flavour of our society. We have given up so much liberty temporarily, lockdowns and so on for the virus, but this would be a shift that would be very, very hard to reverse.
Final word, Matt?
Well, I think there's another issue here, actually, which is there are a lot of people, there's a significant proportion, a minority, admittedly, of people who aren't taking up the vaccine. Now, at the moment, that's their right, but they don't also get the right to mix in areas with people who've been more sensible and more publicly minded. If you're not taking the vaccine, you're putting yourself at risk and you're putting society at risk. And that's, frankly, I think that's the price you pay for not having it.
Can I just come in on that?
Yeah, briefly, because we're going to move on. But go on, Miriam.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think there is a sense that every citizen, unless they have a good reason, does have a duty to take the vaccine if they can. But there are all sorts of health decisions that we all make every day that aren't wise. And yet, as a state, we treat people equally. We treat people in healthcare systems equally, regardless of the health decisions they have made and whether they're viewed as positive or negative health decisions. That is the position of British society. If we go down the route of compulsory vaccination or compulsory certificate passports, we are changing that relationship between citizen and state, and we shouldn't do that lightly.
Let's stick with this theme of civil liberties. We're going to hear from the former Conservative leader in Scotland and now a peer, Ruth Davidson, as she responds to the news announced in the Queen's speech on Tuesday that the government plans to pass a law on voter ID, an approved form of identification. Let's have a listen.
in terms of this particular part of the Queen's speech, I think it's total and I think it's trying to give a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, and that makes it politics as performance. And I think that given where we are and the year we've had, we've got real problems to solve in this country. And the idea that this is some sort of legislative priority, I think, is for the birds.
It's a solution that doesn't exist, according to Ruth Davidson. Miriam, do you agree?
No, I don't agree with her, and I fear that Shami and I are going to stop agreeing right now. Yeah. But I think I don't believe it's a problem.
We can disagree kindly, and we can disagree well. That's fine.
I completely agree with you on that. So I think the question for me is, why wouldn't we want our electoral system to be secure? And it's true there are very few prosecutions for voter fraud, although plenty of allegations. But actually, our system is not secure. I mean, I lost my own polling card last week, and all you have to do is turn up at your polling station and state your name and address. Now, in wards where turnout can be as low as 20% or 30%, if you're minded to impersonate someone else, you've got a very high chance of getting away with it. And in some areas, I mean, a ward in Barnsley was decided this time on a coin toss. So there are some very narrow majorities around that could very much be influenced by voter fraud. And there are plenty of other countries, like France, Germany, Canada, Northern Ireland, that do have voter ID. And I think the important thing is that for anyone who doesn't have the right forms of ID, and we believe that 98% of the population actually does, the government will provide, through local authorities, free voter cards. So it won't exclude anyone. You already have to register to vote every year anyway, actively claiming your right to vote. Yes. So if there was just another box on the form saying, I need voter ID, then I don't see it as a liberties issue. It's just an enforcement of an existing law, which is voter fraud is illegal.
Well, that's the case is for it. Shami, the case against?
I think I agree with Ruth Davidson, I have to say, and I think she probably put it in a more pithy way than
but we won't repeat the word she used.
I don't think the evidence is there that this is a serious problem. I don't think it would just be another tick of a box. I think this would amount in practice, whatever the supposed intentions, to voter suppression. And at a time when we should be encouraging more people to vote, not putting blocks in their way. I think at the moment there are millions of people that don't have passports and driving licences, that can't afford the 75 quid for a passport application, for example. And whilst I hear Miriam, and I do respect, by the way, the way she conducts debate on this programme. It's an absolute pleasure to debate her. I do think that even if we're asking people to plan in advance and apply for local government photo ID, this will discourage the sort of people who aren't like us, who don't live and breathe politics, who have to be nudged and encouraged to go and vote, literally kicked out of bed by your mum on the day to go to the polls. They're not going to plan in advance. So that will be, to some extent, younger people, but at the other end of the scale, older people who are put off by forms, who aren't online, homeless people who can currently vote, black and minority people. There'll be all sorts of people who'll be discouraged by extra hurdles, extra bureaucracy, and that's this is a fundamental right. And I would say, with the hugest respect to Miriam, there's an inconsistency between her position on this and her position just now on internal COVID passports.
All right, well, let Miriam respond.
It's a form of internal passport that is affecting one of your fundamental democratic rights, in this case, to vote.
Miriam?
Thank you. Well, I think the reason that I see it differently as the vaccine passports is that this isn't about changing liberty or changing people's rights. It's actually just an enforcement of an existing rule, which is voter fraud is illegal. This is just about enforcing that to make sure that our democratic systems are secure. Whereas I think the COVID vaccination is a complete new idea, a new settlement, and a potentially dangerous one. And I think that the way around this is, firstly, the bill hasn't yet been published. There's plenty of time to debate the detail. We could pilot it to see what effect it did have on turnout. And actually, in Northern Ireland, they've had voter ID since 2003, and they have higher turnout than we do here. So I think piloting it is the correct way to make sure that it doesn't have any negative effects, and to iron out any difficulties in getting any ID for people who don't have the documents that they're required at the moment.
OK, I don't think the two of you are going to persuade the other, certainly not for the moment. So we're going to move on. Take a listen to this, because you heard it in the headlines. Let's hear a bit more.
When this is over, In terms of a smaller state and deregulation and lower taxes, are there any Thatcherites left in the government?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend and I strongly agree in the role of the private sector in driving our recovery. And actually, what is important, as the right honourable gentleman said, is about businesses having the confidence to invest. And that is why this government has provided not just support for businesses to get through the crisis, but support for businesses through tax cuts, like the super deduction, to help them invest and drive our recovery forward.
The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, responding to that provocative question there from Sir Edward Lee, Tory MP. Miriam, are there any Thatcherites left in the Conservative Party?
Well, I think there are many people who are around who knew her. There are many people who admire her as a person and a leader, her principles and what she stood for, and she certainly turned the country around at a very difficult point. But I think most Conservatives would agree that the challenges of the 1980s are very different to the challenges of the 2020s. And so we need different tools to tackle those problems. I mean, in the 1980s, it was very much about empowering the individual, creating a stronger economy, whereas now I think our challenges are about empowering communities and creating stronger societies. So we need different strategies for that. So yes, there are people who admire her. Are there people who think we should go back to exactly the same policies? No, I don't think there are.
So you're not a Thatcherite. You wouldn't describe yourself as one?
I admire her as a leader,
sure,
but I don't think
But you wouldn't say you're
policies...
a Thatcherite?
No, I wouldn't in an economic sense in terms of would I go back to the policies of the 1980s? No, but I doubt she would say the same if she was alive today. Because conservatism is about pragmatism and keeping the same values but allowing our strategies to evolve.
Right, Jeff, what about you? You've written a book. We're showing our viewers the front cover. Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me. How was it you came to support the Conservative Party of Thatcher?
Well, it was. I didn't come to support the Conservative Party of Thatcher. It was a sort of more pale blue version come 2010. But I suppose in this job, a question a lot of people had asked me was, you got two disabled parents, your dad was a trade union man, and you lived on a council estate. I just always got asked, well, how the hell did you end up voting for this lot? Often by members of my own family. And I thought, well, that's a good question. Yeah. It is a good question. But I suppose what the recent elections and the last general election have suggested is that I'm not alone, actually. This migration of working class voters away from the Labour Party has become a bit more entrenched. So I sort of thought, and it's not a polemical book. I mean, I'd actually be disturbed if anyone changed their mind about anything as a consequence of my book. But what it is just one person's journey. So it's like a worm's eye view of all the big totemic political events of my life, from John Major. And it does feel weird to say totemic and John Major in the same sentence. But I mean, he was the first Prime Minister. When I knew what politics was, he was the guy. Then the credit crunch, then Brexit. And it's just all my experience. And I suppose I'm acknowledging, people often say, but you're biased. I'm like, yeah, I am biased. But I'm also intrigued as to how I got to that point. And that is what the book is, really. And as well as that, both my parents were very political. And a lot of it, both of them are no longer with us, but they just left me with so many rich anecdotes, and I wanted to share those too.
Right, Shami, what's your response to what you just heard from Jeff and the fact that now he doesn't feel he's alone in terms of his background voting for the Conservative Party?
Well, the evidence suggests he's not. Could we have the name of Jeff's book again, please? We had Matt's comedy show plugged, so can we have the name of Jeff's book again? Because I'd like to read it.
Were you not listening when I read it the first time? Go on, Jeff.
Here. It's Where Did I Go Right? Brackets, How the Left Lost Me.
The brackets are important. Yes, Shami.
So I think that the pandemic in particular obviously forced and accelerated the need for much greater community and government intervention to support people in their lives. There's no question about that. Now, the debate that will be going on in the Conservative Party is about how quick to pull away from that. And I think that it's really important that Labour, as it did in World War II, unites, that's quite important, unites to present a post-pandemic vision of a better and more equal society. Because whilst there's been all of this very necessary intervention to support people through this horrible time, it's also going to be important that we equalise after the pandemic. Boris Johnson talked about levelling up, but at the moment we're more unequal than ever and set to be more unequal than ever. Right. So we need more intervention, not less intervention. But I also think that the Labour Party needs to get away from internecine nonsense, frankly, carefully, Matt, some of which you were levelling at me, I think a bit unfairly earlier, and concentrate on policy, on values, on policy, and what we're offering to people in a 1945 moment.
Well, let's hear from Matt, because it sounds like Shami's saying the Tories have parked their tanks on Labour's lawn, certainly economically. I mean, does Keir Starmer have anywhere to go, Matt?
Yes, he does. I think one of Keir Starmer's big strengths is his record as Director of Public Prosecutions. Labour hasn't talked about crime in a way that's really connected with the public since about 2005. And Keir Starmer has a track record of prosecuting bad guys. And I think that is something that you could really outflank the government on. And there's an elephant in the room we're not addressing here. Part of the reason why working class people have deserted the Labour Party, and of course, this happened under Thatcher. Thatcher's victories were built on working class support because of things like Right to Buy and because of the irrelevance of the Labour Party, is the guy that Shami worked for. Jeremy Corbyn drove working class people away from the Labour Party because of the sorts of comments you made earlier in this show. Is they talk about things that people just don't identify with, don't think are relevant.
Right.
And they use language and phrases that drive people away. And until Labour gets away from that sort of thing, people just aren't going to listen to it.
Right, well,
vaccinating the planet could not be more relevant today. It's one of the most relevant questions.
Well, of course, but using phrases like Big Pharma isn't helpful.
Right, but
forget that.
Yeah,
can I just
Shami,
say on this law and order
can you answer the point that because Peter Mandelson, as you know, former cabinet minister, former MP in Hartlepool, the by-election was lost, did also say it was the Jeremy Corbyn cast a long shadow, I think is how he put it. We've had Tony Blair writing in the New Statesman criticising both Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer. He said Corbyn was radical but not sensible. Keir seemed sensible but not radical. Now, we can talk about whether he should stay stum or stop being a backseat driver in a minute. But Shami, just generally, what's your response to what Matt says, that actually the losses were under Corbyn?
My experience of the Labour Party in recent years is that when it gets personal and internecine, it's not just very unpleasant to be in, it is increasingly irrelevant to the public.
And the working class communities?
Well, to all communities. I mean, Matt makes a point about law and order, and I think it is relevant that Keir Starmer can say, you know, I was the director of public prosecution. I've known Keir for many years as a human rights lawyer and as a director of public prosecutions. But there's another point here, which is that the current government, it's not a Thatcherite government, it's in danger of becoming a populist, nationalist, authoritarian government that says one law for us and another for you. We've been debating voter suppression. We've got a bill going through Parliament that would suppress peaceful dissent that my colleague David Blunkett has written against. You know, Labour needs to not just talk about law and order, which is vital, but also talk about people's precious rights and freedoms in the face of this kind of authoritarianism as well.
Jeff?
It comes down to even simpler things as well. I mean, you remember what happened with the Lib Dems and tuition fees, what a long shadow that cast. It wasn't more than a year and a half ago where the Labour Party, right? Democracy is the only time when your vote is the same as everyone else's, right? So Jacob Rees-Moggs, Shami's, Matt's, mine, they're all exactly the same. And the Labour Party flipped to a position of supporting a second referendum. And that, if you think about how sort of influential tuition fees were on people thinking about voting Lib Dem, it's going to cost a much longer shadow over the Labour Party. And the other thing was, and this is something that Labour did successfully under Blair, which was just own the idea of aspiration, that like there was nothing wrong with wanting to do all right for yourself. If anything, when you come from a working class background, the imperative to improve your situation for you and the people around you is even greater. And I think it's not just under Starmer or even Corbyn. This started under Miliband and it's gone back a long way, is that the brand of Labour is a sort of victim-based brand. It's not a very positive thing to associate yourself with. And Sammy's talking about nationalism. I don't think that's very sort of prominent in the minds of most of the people that have turned to vote Conservative. It's simply a case that the offer currently, and this might not be forever from the Conservative Party, is a more appealing one.
Right, not the party of aspiration, Shami.
Well, I think that look. I am a beneficiary of state education. And, like Neil Kinnock, Lord Kinnock before me, owe every life chance I've ever had to the welfare state, to state education, to going to university with no tuition fees, etc., etc. My aspirations in life were fulfilled with that kind of community and state support.
We're running out of time, Shami.
I do agree with Jeff that we need to be aspirational, but we can't have this crushing of our liberties either, and one law for people in government and another law for people in communities.
Well, that's all we've got time for, Shami, because we're out of the show, so I'm going to have to interrupt you from all of us here. Bye-bye.